So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jason Wilson from Severn Trent Water. I'm the Pipeline Industries Guild National Chair, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to today's session. If you weren't aware, this is our fourth and final webinar in the August Guild Goes Green series. The sessions so far have been pretty fabulous, and just in case you've missed them, they were hosted by RSK, Cadent and Tata Steel. All of the sessions, including this one, are available on the Guild website, easily accessible. So feel free to go in there and catch up on the ones that you've missed. So last is by no means least, and today we're privileged to have Samuel Larsen from Water UK to share with us about the water industry's commitment to reaching net zero operational emissions by 2030. Something that's particularly pertinent to me as I'm working in the water industry for Severn Trent Water. So Samuel, we've been told we can call you Sam. So he's the Water UK Policy and Programme Lead for the Net Zero 2030 commitment. The programme is sponsored at CEO level and has significant work streams looking at key parts of the transition to low carbon water services. Sam joined Water UK in 2017, having previously worked in strategy and transformation roles for various engineering and government organisations. He's currently non-exec director at Streetworks UK, so a handy contact to know. That's the organisation representing utilities on streetworks issues. Sam currently enjoys family life in a deep retrofit home in Oxfordshire and spend much of his time, as much time as possible, cycling. Maybe if there's time questions, you can explain to us about deep retrofit. And just before I hand over to Sam, if you do have any questions during the session, just type them into the text box, and provided we have time, we'll run through them. Don't worry if we don't get to your question, because if we don't, we'll make sure we capture them and get a response back from Sam to you after the session. So thanks, Sam. I'll hand over to you. Take it away, please.
Great, thanks Jason, and thanks to the Guild for having me. Really happy to take you through this presentation. I've got about 10 slides. It's obviously a big and broad topic. There's huge interest in net zero in the water industry and in utilities generally, as I'm sure you all know. So in about 30 minutes, I'm going to try and take you through at pretty high level the main concepts to bear in mind. So I'll start with a little bit about what the sector's net zero commitment is, what it means, what it covers, etc. I'll then go on to talk about the main strand of our work, which is the development of our routemap, which will be published in about a month's time. In doing so, I'll give you some insight into emissions trends in the sector and the challenges that the sector faces to get to net zero by 2030. I'll also share some news about future developments and some insight into how the value chain fits into this commitment, and you won't be surprised to hear that of course the entire value chain is crucial to this, and there's lots that all people at all levels can do to help achieve this commitment. And at the end, it would be really helpful to hear, obviously take any questions, but hear from people how their own plans for net zero are going. So I'll start with a little bit about the ambition. I'm sure it's not escaped anybody on the call, things like the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming. Global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees, potentially by 2030. And in so doing, there are limits to adaptation and capacity for some human and natural systems. That's policy speak for there will be significant disruption to natural systems and human ways of life. It's stark stuff. I'm not going to dwell on it because I'm sure you've all engaged with the media on this stuff, so you probably know. But those points have not been missed by the water sector, given its intrinsic link with the environment and the close relationship between providing water services and that potential disruption that could really affect some of our services. So as much as any other sector, absolutely as a sector, crucial that we act on our emissions as soon as possible. I'll just make quick reference to Mark Carney's press coverage in 2019, which at the time sounded quite radical. He said companies and industries that are not moving towards net zero carbon will be punished by investors and go bankrupt. Whilst many organisations welcomed that statement because it is so powerful and so stark, actually there is some signs that that's turning out to be true, with big value being wiped off of some heavy fossil fuels dependent industries. I don't want to make light of that because obviously that sort of disruption is difficult for industries to react to, but there is major change happening around the globe in line with the process of getting towards net zero. So I'll do a quick bit about the programme itself, and by which I mean Water UK's net zero programme. As Jason mentioned in the opening, it is a CEO sponsored project. It actually sits at Water UK's board level, the highest level of the cross-sector group of chief executives, and it has real backing across all the companies. It's obviously aligned with the government's 2050 net zero target. That's a target that covers the UK territorial emissions, and our 2030 deadline is intended to be sector leading in helping government achieve that 2050 target by setting a blueprint for other sectors to follow. We've used net zero. Net zero is the right concept to use to describe reductions in emissions, because most people can grapple with that concept of getting to net zero. However, as a sector which is sort of trailblazing to some extent in this area, net zero is a territorial commitment in its generality, and it's used by countries to describe emissions coming from their land, their borders, their territories. It's not really been applied robustly and scientifically to very many sectors around the world, and to some extent the programme that Water UK is running had to start there. We had to try and work out what net zero meant. I won't bore you with all the detail, just to say that in our case, it means the operational emissions coming from our regulated boundaries, the boundaries of our regulated business. That can be on our land, it can be off our land. So it's a slightly different interpretation of net zero to suit the fact that we're a sector and not a land mass. And other sectors will also have to grapple with that as they make their own detailed net zero plans. Just quickly, net zero effectively means organisations or countries will come up with ways of balancing the emissions that they create with ways of sequestering carbon to offset that emissions, so that overall they put as much atmospheric load, carbon equivalent load, to that they absorb. And the diagram on the right there is intended to show that by 2030, the sector will have those two things at least in balance, meaning that as a sector we are at net zero. Now, I'm going to have to point out at this stage that this discussion is now going to split into two parts for clarity. So the green and blue boxes fall within the net zero operational emissions commitment. So the majority of what is included in our route map is to do with those two green and blue boxes on the scales. There is a grey box on the left-hand side which speaks to our Scope 3 emissions, and I'm going to return to that right at the end because Scope 3 emissions are quite different. I'll explain what they are when we get to that part. Suffice to say that they're not our operational emissions, they're what many people would regard as capital carbon or embedded or embodied carbon within products and infrastructure. And the process for dealing with that is a bit different. So just to sum up, the programme that Water UK is running is intended to produce a route map, a sector leading route map, which will be published next month. on the 23rd of September. We'll be holding a really quite big launch. And that work will then go on to inform individual company plans as to how they will reach net zero and how they will reduce their emissions over time. So I should give a little insight into emissions, what they mean for us as a sector, the sorts of sources. So I'll go on to give a bit of insight into that. First thing to note, there's a chart here that shows our emissions as a time series. Don't need to worry too much about the scopes, but the height of the stacked bars decreases quite rapidly over time. And there is, over the period from 2011 to our baseline year, which was 18-19, a reduction of 43% in the sector's emissions, which is obviously a great starting point. Now, this time series is backed up by very detailed data collected over that period, so over 10 years worth of granular data collected at sector level. So that is data from all the water companies collected in a granular way to measure their individual emissions through things like fleet, through things like process, through things like electricity consumption. And it really is a very detailed granular data set that we think is potentially unique around the world in terms of an entire economic sector having that sort of data over such a long period of time. So there is a 43% reduction, which the water industry can to some extent be proud of. However, that is largely driven by decarbonisation of the electricity grid. The water industry is a major and significant consumer of electricity, and the decarbonisation work in the electricity grid has helped the sector to decarbonise, and it will have exactly the same effect on all the other economic sectors. So there is a contribution which comes, an important contribution which comes from the electricity sector. Speaking more to the sector itself, it has made significant progress in some areas on its own emissions in that same period, things like reducing the dependency on fossil fuels, for things like backup generation, things like CHP, etc. But also energy efficiency gains, and the water industry in the UK compares quite favourably with water industries around the world on things like energy efficiency. Also a big uptick over that period in things like renewables. So lots of water companies, as you may have seen in the media, doing a lot with renewables, be it private wire wind power, be it on-site solar, be it generation of biomethane for use in CHP, etc. So over that period, quite an increase in renewables. But there are new drivers at play, and that progress needs to continue, if not accelerate, as we move into the next two regulatory periods that we have left before 2030. So where do our emissions come from? I've mentioned electricity as being a major contributor towards sector emissions, and 70% of our emissions as a sector is associated in one way or another with carbon dioxide. In the case of the water supply part of the water industry, over 90% of their emissions is directly attributable to the electricity that they consume, and therefore reducing that electricity consumption or generating electricity in a different way can have a major impact on water supply companies' emissions. Wastewater is a different situation and a different set of challenges. A significant amount of their emissions, approximately half of wastewater companies' emissions, are associated with the process of treating biochemical treatment of sewage in sewage works, be that emissions associated with the actual breakdown of sewage in the treatment process, or emissions to do with the processing of sludge. And a significant challenge, a significant research and innovation challenge around how to address the emissions coming from those particular parts of the wastewater industries. So if the industry carried on as it is for the remainder of the period, the 9 or so years to 2030, where would we end up? that's a useful trajectory to have in mind. So grid will continue to decarbonise, and shown here as a waterfall is the contribution coming from things like grid decarbonisation, and there is a significant contribution from that. There's also a significant contribution from the purchase of green energy tariffs, and many of you may know that a lot of the water companies purchase 100% renewable power, REGO-backed power from renewable sources to help in that area already. But there's more to be done around things like energy efficiency over that period. There would obviously be a gradual shift as the whole of the UK moves towards things like electric vehicles that we should include in our business as usual forward trajectory. And if we carry on as we are, our emissions will naturally reduce because of those things. But by no means would it be enough to reach net zero by 2030 without significant reliance on something akin to offsetting, something like tree planting, something like peatland restoration, that, going back to that scale, that compensates for those emissions still coming from the industry at that stage if things remained as they are. So just to summarize some of the areas of challenge, so these are the areas that the energy industry as the asset owner will be focusing on over the next 9 years, and some of the opportunities to make big reductions through relatively small number of measures. So first, the challenges. As I've mentioned, process emissions remains a major challenge. Sewage works, for those of you that are well familiar with them, were inherently designed to vent the products of the biochemical reaction. That's broadly why they are the shape they are, really, is so that the products of that reaction can be vented to the atmosphere. They certainly weren't originally designed to in any way capture that. They don't have any kind of cover that can capture that, so that emission can be directly controlled through containment of any sort. So there is a very significant challenge there for those wastewater companies, where half of today's emissions come from that process, that biochemical treatment of the sewage. And that is a proportion which won't be dealt with by the decarbonisation of the grid or contributions from other sectors. That is a part of the process which is very much for the water industry to solve. So over the next few months, you will see the water industry placing great focus on process emissions and how to reduce them. There's a challenge around fleet. So yes, absolutely, there are electric vehicles available and other sources of fuels, alternative fuels for vehicles. Field trials to date with many of the water companies have shown that whilst there are limited ways that electric vehicles can be used in the fleet, it's by no means universal, and there are major challenges in areas like medium duty vans. Some company analysis have shown that many of the vans don't spend much of their time on sites where there currently is a charger to charge that van. And they don't spend much time on sites where there is an opportunity to install a charger for various reasons. And many of the vehicles don't spend their time overnight on company property. They spend their time overnight parked in the street in some companies' areas. So difficult to install chargers there too. So major challenge around fleet, and you'll probably see the water industry working with partners, specialist partners in the provision of alternative fuel vehicles to try and crack that nut over the next couple of years. Water efficiency will be a big theme. You may have seen Water UK's water efficiency campaign through the summer, highlighting the changes on water demand that have come about through COVID and the relocation of workers from their normal city-based or town-based workplace to a more home-based workplace, placing different demands and different stresses on the network. That campaign highlights the need for greater communications around the importance of saving water in all sorts of ways, both in terms of time of use on peak for things like garden watering and car washing, places great demand on the industry's networks at a time when it's least able to sort of spare that capacity. So basically, both in terms of time of use, but also in terms of total consumption, it's a precious resource, and that climate change that we know is coming, that we already feel is coming, will place greater pressure on the sources of water, particularly in the south and east of the country. Energy efficiency, another major challenge. Our routemap will be setting a tight challenge on things like energy efficiency. So across the industry, a huge amount of energy is used on moving water in one way or another, and we'll be looking for a large number of solutions to energy efficiency across all of the business areas. I should just mention at the end, resilience. That is probably the biggest feedback loop in this for the water industry. Some water companies already reporting that at some times of the summer they are having to source water from further away than they normally would and from deeper than where they normally would, both involving greater use of electricity to move that water further and lift it higher than they previously would in previous years. So there is a feedback here, and there will be a challenge to keep an eye on that feedback and plan that in to make sure that we can address that additional challenge as it hits the industry. Now, that all may sound very, very difficult and like an uphill battle, but to give that balance, there are a huge number of opportunities for the sector that are already mature, that need greater deployment across the sector. Firstly, biomethane, and the sector is already a significant generator of biomethane, some of which it uses for its own purposes within the industry as part of the sludge treatment process, but some of it which is injected into the gas grid to help the gas grid itself decarbonise and to solve that all-important challenge of domestic home heat. So the industry is not 100% deployed on biomethane creation, production, or fully deployed on biomethane injection. So it's a big opportunity for the sector, subject to some enablers to increase that production. Hydrogen production is also a major opportunity. We know that it's useful for society. We know it's useful as a transport fuel. And there are opportunities to relatively straightforwardly create hydrogen from part of the sewage process that the industry is interested in pursuing. So probably further research and innovation coming on that in the autumn. There's also the systems approach to looking at the water cycle. Some of the things that the water sector can do to avoid emissions in other sectors and vice versa. So I've mentioned biomethane creation, which would lower emissions from home heat, but lots of other opportunities, things like recovering heat from treated effluent before it returns to the environment, provides a huge opportunity to recover heat rather than let it be wasted and return to the environment in a way that's a missed opportunity. Also, great opportunity to use more nature-based solutions in dealing with some of the challenges for the sector. Things like catchment management approaches, things like removing pollution at source rather than expanding treatment processes to remove it after the fact. And also using wetlands and other environmental measures such as peatland restoration and tree planting further up catchment to control pollution at source rather than necessarily building more capacity in the treatment system, which in turn requires more energy and chemical consumption. Final mention, great opportunity around new development growth, potentially greater ways of helping planners and developers design and decide where to position homes, which places less stress on the precious networks, mainly on the wastewater side, reducing the need for things like pumping stations in remote rural locations to forward sewage onto areas where it can be treated in existing work, works, and potentially more SUDS installations on development sites, greater use of grey water, and potentially in the right situations and subject to the EA approval, on-site treatment of that sewage rather than the long-term onward pumping through pumping stations to an existing works. So, in a nutshell, that is the net zero route map for our operational emissions, and those are the, as I mentioned at the outset, those are the green and the blue parts on the existing 2030 commitment that we need to bring into balance. So by 2030, the industry needs to reduce its emissions, its direct emissions from its own activities, and anything that it cannot reduce or remove, it will offset through nature-based solutions, tree planting, peatland restoration, and so on. At the start, I said that I would return to scope 3, which is the embedded emissions associated with the infrastructure construction and the products and chemicals that the industry purchases and consumes through its activities. And there's a very different approach required in that area. So the 2030 commitment is really focused on those operational emissions, and the route map that we'll publish in September will set out in great detail how the sector proposes to address those operational emissions. Some companies are already very active in the scope 3, the embedded, the capital carbon emissions, and are already focused on reducing those emissions as well as those operational emissions that are included within the net zero commitment. So Ofwat has been consulting through the summer. There is an APR consultation that ran through the summer. Actually, it closed on Monday of this week, which was looking at future direction for the industry, and it seeks to build on the net zero 2030 operational emissions commitment by introducing new requirements for the industry to report operational emissions in their APRs, a standardized way of reporting those as part of company's APR. But also it asks a question as to should the industry be doing more to measure and report those scope 3 emissions, those embedded emissions in products such as pipelines and such as new equipment, concrete, steel that the industry procures through infrastructure development. So the industry is proposing to measure scope 3 across the industry and report that consistently as a sector by 2025. That's a new commitment that the industry is making through that APR consultation response. And there's a proposal for individual company performance commitments to be introduced perhaps as a means through the PR24 process, the business planning process for the next AMP, so that individual companies can reflect their own circumstances when deciding commitments in that capital carbon area. So a very different approach to dealing with those scope 3 emissions, which is why we treated them slightly differently between the route map and the capital carbon piece. So just to bring that together in a final slide before I think we'll open up for some questions. I think collaboration with the entire value chain here is absolutely crucial. The operational changes that need to be made and the changes on the infrastructure and infrastructure product side are quite broad, quite far-ranging, and will take a lot of collaboration to understand where the opportunities are in that space. Water companies are absolutely familiar that they are the asset owner, and either side of those we have the regulators and we have the supply chain partners. And the water companies have an absolutely pivotal role in ensuring top to bottom that the transformation is enabled through those operational changes and those new products and services that we will need through the supply chain to deliver it. So after the September launch of our route map, which does include a narrative on things like embodied carbon, those new products and services that we'll be looking for, you'll almost certainly see an uptick in interest from companies on those low carbon approaches, either products and services that are already available but not fully deployed across the sector, or new ones that could be developed. So new ones that could be developed through sector innovation, new ones that could be developed through research, through research councils, or through UCWIR. Absolutely apparent to everybody, I think, that we do need to find the best way to transition to net zero, and that will require a higher degree of collaboration on carbon reporting than the industry has seen to date. And you can expect to see in future arrangements across the value chain that carbon will have greater emphasis in decision making. Things like design processes, things like governance processes will include greater emphasis on carbon. The operational implications of different design choices, but also the embedded carbon within products and services associated with new infrastructure. And there's a great opportunity for companies with good ideas to put those forward. So my final tip, I guess, to the group that are looking to do more in this space would be to start with PAS 2080, which is a framework document that many will be familiar with, but if you're not, it's well worth getting your hands on a copy. The water industry was very heavily involved through Anglian Water, Dave O'Reilly at Anglian Water, and Maria Manidaki at Mott MacDonald, two people which have been heavily involved in the routemap creation, as a framework for the industry, the sector as a whole, the entire value chain, to place greater emphasis on carbon in decision making and in design. So that document and the associated guide, there is a publicly available free guide to PAS 2080, which is available if you do a quick internet search, which sets out a huge number of ideas on where to start in helping the sector influence its whole life carbon emissions, right down from regulators, right down through asset owners and down into the supply chain. So probably a great place to start. And I think if I hand back to Jason now, happy to take any questions, but also really keen to hear ideas from the supply chain either today or at a later date about those all important products and services that could help the sector get to net zero by 2030.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Very, very insightful. We do have some questions. So if I kick off with, is generation of hydrogen from grey water or wastewater on your horizon?
Yes, it is. Absolutely. There are a couple of companies which I think are planning announcements in this space. It is something that we know has been tested in the world, elsewhere in the world, and does have potential. There'll be a little on that in the routemap.
Okay, thank you. We've also had one possible scenario with climate change is an increased prevalence of drought. Would a large-scale switch to desalination be needed to meet the demands of population growth, which in turn is energy hungry?
Absolutely. So there are what's known as the strategic resource options. So those are the really big ticket infrastructure projects in the water supply space. Ofwat has a team looking at that particular aspect of the water industry. Those options do include a variety of things to increase the sector's availability of water, raw water. There are things like water transfer schemes. There are things like reservoirs, new reservoirs, and I do understand it. There is one desal plant in the offing. The industry, I think, already has one desal plant, which it doesn't use very often, because in general that process can be quite energy intensive. And that's the feedback loop that I spoke of about halfway through, in that as that resilience challenge comes towards the industry as climate warms, if we're not careful, we end up in exactly that feedback loop, which is why water efficiency is so crucial, because we cannot keep capturing and harnessing more and more water.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We've got a question that says, have you had any positive conversations with housing development planners? My personal experience is that they're not very interested in beneficial suggestions that may cost time or money. So you'll need to convince them of the benefits looking inward.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. That's my experience too. I spent 5 years working in developer services, and before that I spent 4 years working for a consultancy that designed housing, amongst many other things. So yeah, absolutely familiar with the driver there. And what is crucial is that the building regulations place suitable emphasis on things like SUDs, that they include things like grey water in future. We feel, Water UK feels, that the best way to do that is for the sector to have targets, for society to have a water consumption target, per capita consumption target, which everyone would have to work towards in all aspects, in all parts of society, including developers, homeowners, designers, infrastructure providers, would all aim for a PCC target, a per capita consumption target, which would be lower than today. Having that in place would make it easier for things like building regulations to be aligned to achieving that.
Okay, and I do have one last question, which is mine. I was just interested to know what level of government support you've got with your project.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say interest is very high, if not extremely high. We've probably got more interest in this particular piece than the water sector has managed for a while from government and external stakeholders. It really is seen by many sectors and government as a sector leading commitment, especially since it is backed up by those 10 years of granular data collected from an entire sector, and that we will publish in September a credible route map to get there with very detailed specialist analysis on the right measures to take. There's even great interest from government in using the UK water industry's net zero route map as an international example of how industrial sectors can decarbonise at speed in a viable and tangible and credible way. So really it's achieved a very high level of interest. I should also mention that many of the government's existing funding streams, sort of outside of the regulatory process through Ofwat, can be adapted to help enable some of this transformation. So, for example, BEIS has an industrial energy transformation fund. It's 300 million. It includes for things like energy efficiency and deep decarbonisation. DEFRA has a flagship fund of about 600 million, Nature for Climate, which is intended to deal with things like tree planting, peatland restoration, soil improvement, catchment management, nature-based solutions, that sort of thing. And those are the sorts of things that we are proposing will help the industry get to net zero. So there is quite good alignment actually between the sector's proposal and, with a little bit of tweaking around some criteria, existing funding streams coming from government.
Okay, thank you. If we leave questions there because of the time that we've got, if I could just say, I think everybody will agree that it's been a fascinating and engaging session. We will just send a note round to everybody saying if they do have suggestions or ideas that they'll send them back to you, and if there's any follow-on questions that come out afterwards, we'll get those over to you and get responses shared out. So thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for dialing in. But just before you all disappear, just a quick little reminder that the next webinar is on hydrogen, a pipeline to the future, which is on the 1st of September. And don't forget, I'll do a quick plug for the National Dinner. Information on this and the up and coming webinars are all available on the Guild website. And as we said at the start, for those of you who didn't join right from the very beginning, this session is recorded and will be available on the Guild website. So thanks, Sam. Thanks, everybody else. Enjoy your afternoon, and I will catch up with you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks all.